Plants are mostly watered. 80 to 90% of a plant's fresh mass is water. But if you dry a plant out and you just look at that remaining 10 or 20%, the vast majority of that dry mass, 96% of it, is carbon, assimilated from CO2 via photosynthesis. The remaining 4% are inorganic substances that were drawn up from the soil. Within that 4%, there are a lot of different chemical elements. More than 50 have been identified, but not all of them are essential. There are 17 essential elements, and these are chemical elements that are required for the plant to complete their life cycle. How did researchers figure out what these 17 essential elements were? Well, they used hydroponic culture to determine which chemical elements are essential. They essentially would put the plants, instead of in soil, in water, and they would add and subtract different things from the water and see whether the plant would survive or not. For instance, here we'd have a control solution with all of the minerals that we think they need, and then we'll have experimental solutions where you take one of those minerals out and you see how the plant does. In this case, we took potassium out, and you can see that it doesn't grow nearly as well, and you have this yellowing of the veins, and so potassium appears to be an essential nutrient. These are the essential elements in a plant, all 17 of them. Some of them are needed in large amounts, like carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and nitrogen. Some of them are needed in small or very small amounts. Right? So molybdenum is necessary, but it's necessary in 1/10,000th of 1% of the total mass. The essential elements that are needed in large amounts are called macronutrients, so carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, etc., etc. They're called macronutrients not because they're needed more, but because more of them are needed. And the remaining 8 at the bottom of that chart that I showed you are micronutrients. Again, not because they are needed any less, they're just as necessary as the macronutrients, but you need less of them. It's the same with humans, by the way. It's a different set of nutrients, although very related, but micronutrients are just nutrients that we need smaller amounts of. Some of these minerals are abundantly available, and you don't need very much of them, so they're very rarely going to be an issue. The most common deficiencies or limitations are nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. So you will often see NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and K for potassium, when you go to the store and you buy fertilizer, right? Now, that'll show you the amounts of those 3 things because they're most important and they're most often lacking in your soil. And as you can see, the leaves will do different things if they are deficient in different minerals. So this is a healthy leaf. By the way, this is a monocot. These are parallel veins. If they're phosphate deficient, they could be purple on the outside and kind of twisty. If they're potassium deficient, they could be yellow on the outside. And if they're nitrogen deficient, they can be yellow on the inside of the leaf, closer to the vein. Biologists now have the ability to modify the genes of a plant so that it can better fit the soil. For instance, aluminum in acidic soils can damage roots. This can reduce crop yields, and biologists have introduced bacterial genes into the plant genomes, and that allows the plants to secrete acids that bind and tie up the aluminum, and it allows them to grow in soils that would be toxic otherwise. Similarly, if you're growing in really wet, waterlogged soils, you can deprive roots of oxygen, and they can die just like you would if you were deprived of oxygen. But rice has a gene that allows them to grow in those big rice paddies where they're really submerged, and that gene can be spliced into other plants. As we talked about in Chapter 31 with fungus, plants have mutualistic relationships with a lot of different organisms in the soils. Again, fungus, also microbes like bacteria, and these mutualistic relationships are very, very important for them to survive. The prefix rhizo refers to roots, and the rhizosphere is the layer of soil that's kind of bound to a plant's root, and it's going to contain a lot of different bacteria that are decomposers, which will be decomposing old organic matter and making those nutrients available for the plant, and also nitrogen fixers. Rhizobacteria are nitrogen-fixing bacteria that that thrive in that area around the roots. A lot of them will actually enter roots and infect the root cells, although this is not a bad infection. And they get sugars and amino acids and other good things secreted by the roots, and in return, they provide nitrogen that they're able to fix. In addition to that nitrogen, they also can produce hormones that stimulate plant growth. They can produce antibiotics and protect the roots from bacterial infections. And they also absorb sometimes toxic metals that could be toxic to the roots. I want to back up to this nitrogen thing because it's really important. Nitrogen is one of the most important elements for life broadly, especially plants. It's found in amino acids and proteins. It's found in nucleic acids in DNA and RNA. And it's abundant. There is nitrogen everywhere in the atmosphere. It's actually the most abundant element in the atmosphere, N2, right? It's two atoms of nitrogen attached together into a molecule of N2. But it's a triple bonded molecule. So it's really, really hard to break those nitrogens away from each other and make them usable or fix them, right? So even while 70% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, none of that stuff I breathed in can I use. And so I rely on plants. I have to eat my nitrogen. And plants rely on bacteria, part of this nitrogen cycle, because plants can only absorb nitrogen as NO3 or NH4. And so to get that, you have to have soil bacteria. So here we have nitrogen in the atmosphere. And nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil can take N2 and break it apart. They have the enzymes to do this and convert it to NH3, which can then be turned into NH4 when you add a hydrogen ion from the soil. And this is ammonium. And ammonium is now something that plants might be able to take advantage of. But there are also nitrifying bacteria that can take ammonium and turn it into nitrate, which is much easier for plants to take up. So the ammonium and the nitrate plants can bring into their roots and utilize for their metabolic processes. Now, this nitrate eventually, if it's still in the soil, will be denitrified by bacteria and sent back into the air as N2, and that is the nitrogen cycle, which we'll get back to a little bit later. Now, we also have not just the atmospheric N2, but we also have nitrogen in organic material, that leaf litter that's breaking down, for instance, in this humus. And ammonifying bacteria can take that stuff also and turn it into ammonia, which becomes ammonium, and may or may not become nitrate. And again, both of those things are able to be taken up by the roots of a plant. A lot of plants specifically have mutualistic relationships with rhizobium bacteria, especially legumes, so like beans, soybeans, for instance. We call these nitrogen-fixing plants for this reason, but it's not actually the plants that are doing the nitrogen fixing. It's the rhizobium bacteria that will infect the roots. These are bacterioids infecting the roots. But again, in this case, infection is not bad. They will grow and they will form these root nodules, and they will bring in usable nitrogen for the soybean, and the soybean will respond by allowing them to have, for instance, sugars or amino acids. And this is why very often farmers will plant things like soybeans or other legumes as cover crops when they rest their fields, and they'll plow them back into the soil to maintain a good level of nitrogen in their soil. So the rhizobium provides nitrogen that in a usable form to the plant, and the plant provides sugar and also an anaerobic environment to these rhizobium. They do not like oxygen. They don't survive well in an aerobic environment. And so the inside of the plant is a nice anaerobic environment for them to dwell in. Here's essentially how it works. You get a root hair that becomes infected with some rhizobium bacteria, which begin then invading the cortex and dividing in the cortex, and they form this bacterioid that we looked at before in terms of a slide. And they will continue dividing in the pericycle. And then they will grow and form this larger bacterioid and eventually a nodule, right? And then this is the larger nodule, and now this is a much bigger nodule. So this is a mix of plant cells, sclerenchyma cells, and also the bacterial cells in here both forming this giant nodule, which is what you see when you look at these things here. And again, once they form those nodules, then they can, they chemically talk to each other and they can exchange nutrients like nitrogen and sugars. Because some plants are better at having these mutualistic relationships with rhizobium and nitrogen fixtures than others, farmers have for a long, long time been practicing crop rotation. For instance, you might plant a non-legume like maize one year that would take a lot of nitrogen out of the soil, and then the next year you would plant a legume like soybeans or something that would then replenish the soil with nitrogen. Often that legume isn't even harvested, it's plowed into the soil so that the soil will retain its nitrogen content for the next couple of years. Also, alder trees and tropical grasses can benefit from nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There are aquatic ferns and rice paddies that have mutualistic cyanobacteria that fix nitrogen. There are all kinds of mutualisms that we take advantage of in agriculture. In addition to mutualistic relationships with rhizobium to fix nitrogen, most plants also have mutualistic relationships with fungi, and we call these, if you recall from chapter 31, mycorrhizae. Myco meaning fungus, rhizo meaning roots. And the fungus, again, just like the bacteria, will benefit from a supply of sugar from the plant, and they will increase the surface area for water and mineral absorption for the plant, which benefits the plant. And sometimes they'll also break down rocks, for instance, and release minerals that wouldn't be otherwise available to the plant. And sometimes they can secrete growth factors that will cause roots to grow and branch so they can do more absorption on their own. There's evidence of mycorrhizal fungi almost 500 million years ago. So they might have been one of the things that helped plants colonize land in the first place from their algal ancestors. Additionally, if you recall, there are really two groups of mycorrhizae: arbuscular mycorrhizae, which actually form these arbuscules that push into the actual cells, like through the cell walls, into the cells of the roots, and there they can exchange nutrients, versus ectomycorrhizae. Ecto means on the outside, and they don't actually push into the cells. They form these sheaths, and they kind of push between the cells to the outside of the cell wall, the hyphae do. Ectomycorrhizae are less common. They occur in about 10% of plant families, a lot of trees like pine, spruce, oak, etc., etc. Arbuscular mycorrhizae are found in a lot more types of animals. Again, the hyphae go into the cells and form these arbuscules, and so grains, legumes, a lot of very important crops have arbuscular mycorrhizae associated with them. These microbial associations are really, really important, and sometimes farmers or foresters will inoculate seeds or soils with fungal spores or old soil with bacteria to promote the mycorrhizae and the rhizobium. And sometimes exotic plants, invasive plants, harm native plants by disrupting these interactions. For example, if you look at the amount of biomass produced or growth of uninvaded areas, it's much higher than invaded areas, and the invaded areas are very similar to uninvaded areas that have been sterilized of their bacteria and their fungus. Some plants also have weird ways of getting nutrients. For instance, epiphytes, they literally grow on top of another plant, and they get their water and minerals not from the soil but from the rain. The staghorn fern being an example of an epiphyte, again, not relying on soil. Other plants, like mistletoe, Merry Christmas, are parasites. They don't rely on soil either, but they get their nutrients by invading the plant that they are living on. They have a host that they extract nutrients from. Some plants live in soils, but the soils might be poor in specific nutrients, very often nitrogen. And so they get those nutrients by trapping insects, digesting them, and eating them. They are carnivorous plants. Things like the Venus flytrap, which will trap shut with a fly, pitcher plants which lure bugs into this barrel that has digestive juices, or sundews which have sticky bits that smell like sweet stuff, and they will trap bugs and then digest them, and then they'll absorb those extra nutrients again, like nitrogen.